One word about my background. I predominantly deal with smart contracts and blockchains. Sorry for that. Although I was kind of pushed into smart contracts and blockchains, like kicking and screaming because I didn't really want to do them. But here I am. But quite a bit of my research is, of course, in contract law, because my PhD is in contract law. And my theory is that one of the main challenges, not just in contract law, but in many legal areas, is not the electronic form, because many of you who are old enough to remember, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, everybody was going on about, oh my God, electronic transactions or online transactions. And yeah, in the good old days. So everybody was freaking out about the electronic form. My theory is that the biggest challenge is actually the new interface. And this is what I will be talking about today. Click, please. Oh, thank you, Jennifer. Okay, guys, so I'm going to jump straight into the discussion. So smart objects. Smart objects, you might have heard about them. So smart fridges, smart toothbrushes, Fitbits, smart Nespresso machines, etc., etc. We have the world-leading expert on smart objects in this conference, Dr. Manwaring. Hello. But what are the main legal problems with smart objects? So normally when you read the majority of articles, smart objects cause or are discussed in the context of ownership. So you will read a lot about licensing restrictions. So you buy a coffee machine or a Fitbit or a toothbrush or whatever smart device you have bought. And of course, you encounter lengthy end user licensing agreements without which the object is virtually unusable. Then it also usually turns out that you need some additional services, additional subscriptions, which means more terms and conditions, more licenses. And of course, you have a problem because there is a combination of goods and services from multiple entities. So in the end, smart objects are usually discussed in the context and the legal problems relating to the presence of multiple inconsistent terms from different entities. Now, it is a massive problem. It is very disorienting. And actually right now, today is the 24th. Yes, I'm about to get my new laptop in about 5 days. And I have put aside 2 days just to set it up because there will be so much setting up with clicking and agreeing to things. However, please note that from a purely legal perspective, the majority of those problems are not really new. They're just exacerbated. Because as I said, when you buy a laptop or a smartphone, I'm sorry, a laptop is a smart object when you really look at it. And the amount of software and services and apps, I don't even know where to start on an average laptop you need if you set up a laptop from scratch, or even if you restore from backup. You need a day. You need a day to set it up because you have subscriptions, you have licenses from I don't know, but I think in my case probably about 30 or 40 sources. Of course, so it's the same problem with smart objects. So here, the first trick is we need to distinguish between the purchase of a smart object, which of course raises all those problems. It's extremely inconvenient, extremely annoying, and labor intensive, but kind of legally nothing new. The drama and the new problems really start when you transact or purchase things through the smart object. So the smart object is not the object of the transaction. The smart object is the means through which you transact. And of course, on a high level, the legal areas involved, and thank God it's nothing as dramatic as Angelica's presentation. We have to deal with predominantly contract law, so different terms and conditions, consumer protection, and of course, privacy. And those problems, or those three groups of issues, are really jurisdiction agnostic, because the same problems will be encountered in the US, in New Zealand, Australia, in the EU. I think the situation in the EU is most dramatic because we have extremely heavy and restrictive, or heavy consumer protection regulations. And of course, we have the GDPR and contract law on top. Please note that the paper I have linked to, and this presentation is based on a paper with the same name, it was published about 2 years ago, deals with EU regulations, but you can really directly transpose it onto any other jurisdiction. Click, please. Thank you. So just by way of background, smart objects are quite often discussed in the context of the phenomenon called ubiquitous computing. This is what Dr. Manwaring mentioned earlier in the context of socks. So, okay, I'm not going to be talking about socks, but ubiquitous computing is basically about computing power, embedding computing power and connectivity in physical objects. So the internet is everywhere. So of course, and ubiquitous computing is composed or comprises multiple smart objects. And now we need to introduce another distinction. Okay, we need to think, when we talk about smart objects and when we talk about ubiquitous computing, we need to think of three completely different spaces: private spaces, smart home, then shops, retail technologies, which in my humble opinion are the most awesome ones, because I mean, there's some really funky examples. And of course, public spaces. So when we talk about ubiquitous computing in public spaces, it's usually synonymous with smart cities. Click, please. Click. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, seriously, what's the big deal? On the screen, you see an ordering kiosk in McDonald's. And yes, I do go to McDonald's because I love their ice cream. I love their ice cream, and I also love playing with touch interfaces. Angelica, please don't laugh at me. I can see your face. Don't make fun of me. Acknowledging that one goes to McDonald's is kind of embarrassing, but okay. It's just for research purposes, of course. But think about it. You enter a physical restaurant, whether it's, McDonald's or KFC or whatever it is, but you order and you pay at the kiosk. So there's no human interaction. It's online. Then you just pick up the stuff pick up your delightful ice cream. You pick it up from the counter. So was this an online or was this an offline transaction? Well, this is an online contract, technically speaking, because formation occurred online, although it was in the physical premises of the seller. So just when law has caught up with this, dealing with online transactions, and particularly in the EU has, enacted quite a few laws on the assumption that you can draw this very clear division. Now you're online and now you're offline. But suddenly, if you have smart objects, if you go to McDonald's and order online, this division is blurred, and you can no longer say, oh, this is an online contract. Oh, this is a traditional contract. And, how do you even classify this transaction? Then also, what is the point of sale in the context of smart homes, especially on the famous dash button by Amazon that you can literally place underneath at the side of your toilet? So what? Your toilet becomes a point of sale, or your fridge? Again, some laws, mainly in the EU, assume that the transaction occurs at a point of sale. The same problem with Nespresso machines and smart toothbrushes. Next click, please. Next slide. Thank you. So what are the new problems? So smart objects introduce new types of interfaces. So new ways of communicating with computers, or even more broadly, more ways of interacting with computers. Because, I mean, how do we usually communicate with computers? I mean, the same way I'm talking to you now. We have a screen. We have a screen and we have a keyboard. Of course, we have a microphone, camera, etc., etc. But computers are predominantly associated with screens, keyboards, and mice. And suddenly we have smart objects, some of which actually technically qualify as computers, but they have no screens. I mean, my Nespresso has no screen. Sorry, my Alexa has no screen. They have tiny screens, or it gets worse, they have alternative display surfaces, so they can beam things on other objects. So no screen. So it's even difficult to say, does it have a screen or not? Because a different object becomes a screen. And of course, no keyboard and no mouse. Next click, please. Next slide, click. Oh my God. So guys, I just thought we're gonna walk down memory lane for a couple of slides. So look at the traditional desktop. We have, the screen looks, really, really vintage. I think this is one of the first Apples. So a massive screen. We have a printer somewhere, and the main input mechanism is, of course, the keyboard. There's even no mouse here. And please note, okay, let me just ask you this question. Do you think that this computer, this object, is difficult to miss? I assume it is very difficult to miss because it's so massive. Please note, not only do you have a very, classic form of interaction, or, two classic interfaces, the output is a printer or a screen, the input is a keyboard, because those little babies didn't have microphones and cameras yet. But this object is massive. So you can't miss it. You can't say, oh crap, I had no idea there was a computer. Also, please note, traditionally, we have always chosen when and whether we interact with a computer. Click next slide, please. So, okay, laptop, this looks much, much nicer. I think this is a MacBook Air probably, or maybe a Microsoft Surface, I don't know. Nothing new, believe it or not. It just looks better because the storage is no longer a cassette. The storage is a hard drive hidden inside the machine. And it maybe has a touch screen, there is a trackpad, but still the main output is printer or screen. The main input is some form of, it's either a mouse or a touchpad and a keyboard. Click. Okay, this was Jennifer's favorite slide. I think after, when we were doing the technical test yesterday with Jennifer, we kind of stopped here and talked about sci-fi movies for a very long time. So guys, we see some progress. In the future, everything looks like an iPad. So no more keyboards. And those of you who are Star Trek fans, you may remember all the surfaces, all the ways we interact with computers are touch interfaces, and also a lot of voice interfaces, because the main onboard mainframe, I think it was actually called computer, nothing very exotic. You just talk to it and it talks back to you. So please, the keyboards disappear and we are surrounded, or should I say, we live inside a space covered in iPads, I guess. Click. Okay, yes, I forgot to warn everyone, there's going to be a slide with Tom Cruise. I apologize, some people are allergic, so am I. Okay, and next progression, haptic interfaces. So communicating with computers by means of gestures. Okay, haptic interfaces are actually really tricky, because unless you are Tom Cruise, so you have, I don't know, amazing upper body strength and an amazing triceps, which is somewhere here, I don't think that many of us can maintain this position for more than 2 or 3 minutes. I mean, feel free to try, your cameras are off. Okay, haptic interfaces, you manipulate objects, virtual objects through touch, but I don't think you can keep your arms up for so long. Click, unless you're Tom Cruise. Click. Okay, and of course, the computer disappears completely. This is a screenshot from the movie Her. The computer is in the pocket. It has a tiny camera and observes the world around us or around her. And all the interactions are voice. Input, output is voice. Click, please. Okay, so now after this little comic break or, quick history of computer interfaces, let us think about traditional transacting interfaces. So how do we transact in the real world? We kind of need to do this because legal principles, including consumer protection and particularly contract law, they were all created with certain assumptions in mind. Click. Okay, so this is a traditional transacting interface. So traditionally, we actually transacted or contracted or interacted face-to-face with people. So as I said, please look closely. Legal principles developed with certain assumptions in mind, that there is no intermediating technology, that people see each other's faces, people gesticulate at each other. It's not about haptic interfaces, it's actually, shaking hands or saying, I am not going to pay you that much, this is too expensive, okay? So for thousands of years, everything was face-to-face. Click, please. Thank you. Well, shop still face-to-face. We have a shop counter and a cash register, and many of you may be remembering Contract Law 1 and all the cases about cash registers and supermarkets and who makes an offer, etc., etc. Click, please. Okay, supermarket. It gets increasingly automated, but it is still face-to-face. Although please note that self-checkout is increasingly popular, and of course we have quite a few shops which have implemented a technology where you just walk in and you shop and go. There's no human interaction whatsoever because the shelves have inbuilt readers. There's, of course, the market leader in this particular area is Amazon. But please note, even when you go to a supermarket, even when you go to Amazon Go, you still know at least that you are shopping, that you are in a transacting environment. Click, please. Okay, thank you. And of course, here again, no big deal. You could say, oh my God, this is a completely new interface. Everything changes because especially after COVID-19, a lot of us switched to online shopping and online transaction, online life in general. But please note, this has been around since the 1980s. So I don't think anybody is particularly shocked or anybody sees much novelty in the context of online shopping. The thing here is we are still at a laptop, desktop, or a computer. There is still a relatively familiar interface. But please let me remind you, and I think even Andelka mentioned it on one of her slides. Andelka, I think you mentioned wrap contracts. We have about 30 years worth of cases, especially in the US, dealing with so-called click wrap and browse wrap agreements. So here you're still sitting at a traditional computer, but you are communicating with the seller by means of a mouse. You're not really providing input in the keyboard. You're just clicking around and expressing consent by means of a mouse and clicking little graphic elements. And just FYI, we have thousands of cases whether those clicks can be regarded as consent. There's a lot of drama, although we are still at a traditional computer/online contracting interface. So here the plot thickens, but you're still at a computer and you still have a familiarity with the input and the output. And most importantly, I think when we go to Amazon, we kind of know that we went there to shop. So it's not a surprise that, oh my God, suddenly I formed a transaction. Click next slide, please. Okay. A pure voice user interface. Thank God, Alexa is something that we buy for our private use. So it's an object that is part of our smart home. We buy it, we set it up. It takes a long time to set up, actually, to install all the apps. Of course, Alexa is a gateway to Amazon, so it has pretty much all the same functionality as Amazon. You can transact through it, but it's not that dramatic because although the interface is voice, so it's all voice commands, of which you have to remember quite a few, but it requires prior enrollment and you're actually taught how to interact with it. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is not my kitchen, sorry, but in the future, actually not in the future, this is already happening. Here you don't see a single computer, but the idea is that quite a few of those objects will have embedded computation and connectivity. So you don't have a single traditional computer interface. Next click, next slide, not click, God, click. Okay, so what are the legal problems here? As I said, the main drama is the new interface. So many legal principles and regulations, and I mentioned earlier, so it's contract law, it's all privacy and data protection, privacy regulations, and of course, a lot of consumer regulations require two broad categories of requirement. You have to provide certain information. This is pretty universal throughout the world, so it's called disclosure. And you have to obtain consent. Sorry, I'm using consent. Some prefer consent, assent. I kind of got used to using consent, but of course, there are other words that are synonymous. So just think about it. How do we usually provide information and how do we express consent? So for thousands, I don't know, for hundreds of years, you just tell someone this is how you provide information. And when I was growing up, they just give you a big printout of documents, or they send you somewhere, or those terms are available, at the station, or once you park the car somewhere, they will be displayed somewhere, okay? And how do we express consent? It's a bit of a different issue here. Click, please. Okay, so first thing, providing information. Of course, it's under contract law. It is usually discussed in the context of provision of terms, in the context of the sequence of incorporation of terms, by notice, by signature, etc. Consumer protection standard, everywhere consumers are protected because they have been provided with information. Privacy protection, GDPR, the same issue. And of course, we have the same problem with industry-specific disclosures and disclaimers. Think about pharma, think about banking and finance. Now, please look at the bottom. We never really had to think about this level of detail because contract law, as you know, judges just say things, terms have to be accessible, etc., etc. Do you have to, is it a push method or is it a pull method? When you provide information push, it means that the seller or the provider of the information has to be active. Pull is when you, the consumer, or the other transacting party has to be active. So suddenly it turns out that is some of those traditional instruments, and of course cases in contract law, are extremely difficult to interpret as to the level of activity required from the other party. Next slide, click. Click. Next slide, please. Oh, something has happened. Next slide. Oh, we have a... Oh, thank you. Guys, same thing with expressing consent, contract law, consumer privacy, industry specific. Now, very few regulations require express consent. Most require implied consent, which raises a massive risk in the context of novel interfaces, because you could be providing consent inadvertently or literally unintentionally. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the biggest problem is first-time encounter versus prior enrollment. Prior enrollment, no problem. It is usually for smart homes. So basically, you have bought your coffee machine, you have bought your Alexa. So theoretically, no drama. You should learn the commands. You actually know that you're dealing with a little computer. But the problem are first-time encounters, especially, I'm not sure that you guys remember airports. It's where planes land and take off. If you go between airports, if you go between public spaces, or if you're in different shops, the checkout terminal, or the consumer, the customer kiosk, they will all be different, and you may go hungry because you will not know how to order food. Next slide, please. Oh my God, okay. This is an example. We can actually, this is self-replenishment printers. There were quite a few articles also in the legal press that they will cause a lot of legal problems, but they really haven't, because self-replenishment smart printers are really based on prior enrollment. So you have to set them up for them to order their own ink. Next slide, please. I spent too much time on Tom Cruise and now I'm running out of time. Dreadful. So guys, the main constraints are, of course, as I said earlier, the limited different screen sizes or lack of screen, different output and input methods, and therefore new or novel or unfamiliar communicative signs. But from our perspective, and I'm not talking as a lawyer, I'm talking as the end user, the biggest drama I encounter, and I lived in Singapore for a long time, and I was encountering those smart objects in public spaces and in retail spaces, I could not remember all the commands and all the conventions, because every interface is a little bit different. And sometimes you don't even know whether something is smart or not. So I would come up to something and start touching it, and people would think that I'm crazy, but I was actually checking whether it will react to touch or not. And of course, but a big problem, particularly at airports, thank you, attention deficit. If we could just stop at the last slide, and I'm going to shut up and look at the questions. So okay, cool. Thank you. Yeah, too much Tom Cruise.